want to talk about swatching and why it's important. And before you cringe and click away from the video, realize that swatching is super important if you want any of your knitted things to fit right. So you kind of just have the mindset that you need to swatch, and it's just part of your preliminary process. And it really is well worth the few minutes or even an hour that it takes to do that, especially if you're knitting a sweater for someone. You want it to fit, right? You don't want to have a lot of frogging and ripping and frustration when things don't fit. So I realize swatching may not be your favorite thing to do, but you know, it's worth a Netflix episode of time, right? You can just knit a swatch while you're watching your favorite show. So let's say, for example, if it tells you 20 stitches and X number of rows. So that's referring to the if you were to knit a 4-inch block, a square, then you would have 20 stitches across or 5 stitches per inch, okay? So pretty simple, and then however many rows that would be, depending on the yarn. Given the needle recommendation, you know, I take all that with a grain of salt. It's simply a place to start. If it's a yarn you've never used before, start there, okay? Knit a 2 or 3 inch square, measure it. Now, if you're going to do it accurately, you would go ahead and knit a 4-inch square so that you can measure several places inside that square to get an average and to see, because your tension changes whether you're, you know, how you're feeling from day to day or time to time. Now, I've knitted enough where I'm pretty consistent, but a lot of people are just starting out, and maybe you're purling back and you're knitting and you're purling and you're knitting, and so you need to average that out. Swatching in the round is sometimes for people a little bit different because they're not purling at all. Sometimes people purl more loosely than they knit, and so that's why you take an average. If you're swatching in the round, that can sometimes be different, as I mentioned, because you're not purling. I don't really notice that much difference for me, but again, I've been knitting quite a while, so it may or may not be different for you. Everybody's different. That's why that yarn label is simply a guideline or a place to start. So this shawl back here that I have, you know, gauge wasn't super important with that because it's going to be however wide it is, and it's as long as however it is. Now, the only reason it might be important is if I'm worried I'm going to run out of yarn, right? If you're doing color changes or you want to make sure you have enough. So I usually buy a little extra yarn to account for that anyway. Now, that's fingering weight yarn, and I knitted that in a really loose, airy, kind of a lacy shawl. And I used size 6 needles for fingering weight yarn. That's sock yarn. On the flip side, I knitted these socks a long time ago, and these are almost 10 stitches per inch, and I think I knitted these on either a 2.25 millimeter, which is a US size 1, or even a 0, which is a 2.0 millimeter. But there is a lot of stitches per inch, right? It's a very dense fabric, and I wanted that for socks because they need to be able to wear well. You know, a more dense fabric, you're not going to have the yarn is laying right next to itself, and it can't shift as much and rub against its neighboring strand of yarn. And so it's going to wear better than something that's really open and light. This is also fingering weight. This is a hat I'm working on. It's also fingering weight, but I'm using a size 3. It's pretty thick fingering. It's like more like a, even though it's, you know, technically defined as fingering, it's like a 6-ply. Whereas this one was like a 4-ply, and this one's probably 8 or 9 stitches per inch. So it really, even though all of these things are classified as fingering weight yarn, it really does make a difference. So you really do need to swatch, particularly if it's a yarn you haven't used before. Then you don't know, based on your own individual tension, you don't know whether you need to use a size 2.5 millimeter or a 2.0 millimeter. And you're thinking, well, it's only half a millimeter. But I'll tell you this, over the course of hundreds and hundreds of stitches in a sock, that half a millimeter or that 1 stitch per inch difference will become an exponential difference over the course of hundreds and hundreds of stitches. Do you see what I mean? So some people think when they knit a sweater, oh, I'm only off by half a stitch. You know, if the pattern calls for 5 stitches per inch, well, and now I've gotten 5.5 stitches per inch. That's going to become a compounding exponential problem over thousands of stitches that it takes to make a sweater. So it is important to get gauge, and it is important to take the time to swatch. Now, the only time I really don't swatch is if I'm knitting a sock from the toe up, and I'll tell you why. if I'm knitting this sock and I'm going from the toe up, now that's not how I knitted this one, but just for the sake, just let me show you. If I'm starting here and I'm knitting up, and then I can measure this portion of this. This is straight stockinette stitch, and along with some dog hair, I can measure this as my swatch, and I'm that much far ahead if it's correct and if it fits, and if I like the resulting fabric. Now with a toe-up sock, I can increase to the number of stitches that I want. And so I can just keep increasing to the correct diameter until I can try it on. But if it's not for someone who's in my house and I know the circumference of their foot and I know how it needs to be, I can go ahead and just increase up as far as I need to. If it's not right, let's say I've used too big of a needle to start with and the fabric is kind of, it's not as tight as I want, it's not as dense as I prefer, and I'm worried that's not going to wear well. Well, then I've only knitted like an inch or so. I can tear that back and I can start over, and it's no big deal, right? I can just knit the toe over again and carry on my way. Now that's not quite the same if you're knitting from the cuff down. And also it's difficult to tell with ribbing. It's going to be really difficult to tell how many stitches per inch with ribbing. So if you're knitting from the cuff down, I definitely would swatch first, just so that you know what to expect later as far as the measurement of your foot or your intended recipient. So I hope that makes sense, and I hope you understand why swatching is important. It's very, very different. I have people ask me weekly, if not daily, at least several times a week in our group, should I use a size 1 or 2 needle with this and this yarn? I'm like, well, you have to work that out for yourself because every knitter knits differently. So I might use a 2.25 or US size 1 needle for a particular sock yarn, but a friend of mine who knits very, very loosely, she needs to go down to like a 0 or even a 00 to achieve the same stitches per inch because she knits very loosely. If you have a brand new knitter that knits really tight and their tension is tight, they might have to use a size 2 to achieve the same stitches per inch that I do. So it's very individual. That's why that label on the yarn is simply a guideline. All right, happy swatching. If you have any questions, let me know in the comments below. And if you find these videos helpful, click like and subscribe. All right, thanks so much for watching.